That gate, she screeched, her voice a grating symphony of entitlement that scraped across the otherwise tranquil afternoon, will be opened, and it will remain open for the duration of the event. This is non-negotiable. I watched her from my side of the ancient wrought-iron gate. Her name, as I would soon learn, was Karen, a fact that felt less like a name and more like a diagnosis. She was a plus-sized woman, poured into a painfully bright pink polo shirt bearing a vaguely fascistic logo of a pine tree, constrained within a perfect circle. Her hands were planted on her ample hips, a posture of command she had likely practiced in front of a mirror. Behind her, a small contingent of nervous-looking men were starting to unload folding tables and a garish, inflatable bounce house from a pickup truck. They were on my road. My private, deeded, 150-year-old road. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association annual block party was, apparently, underway. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, a tactical pause I had learned long ago. Let the opposition fill the void. They almost always do, and in doing so they reveal their strategy or lack thereof. "This is a community access road," she finally barked, confirming my assessment. "It is for the use of the community, and this is a community event." I surveyed the scene with a slow, deliberate gaze. My property, 160 acres of timber and pasture that had been in my family since the Grant administration, was an island of history surrounded by a sea of beige modernity. The subdivision, Whispering Pines, had sprung up a few years ago, a cancer of vinyl siding and meticulously manicured lawns where an old dairy farm used to be. My long gravel drive, the very road upon which her troops were now attempting to establish a beachhead, was the only access from the main county highway to my farmhouse, which sat nestled nearly a mile deep into the woods. The subdivision had its own grand entrance a quarter-mile down the highway, complete with a ridiculous brick facade and perfectly spaced, non-native trees. My road was mine. It was as much a part of my property as the oak tree my great-grandfather planted by the front porch. "This," I said, my voice calm and low, "is private property. You are trespassing." A flicker of something, not uncertainty but perhaps annoyance that I was not immediately capitulating, crossed her face. "Do not be difficult. We have a permit. We do this every year." "You have never done this here," I stated. It was a simple fact. For the 3 years since my retirement from the Army Corps of Engineers, I had enjoyed a profound and well-earned peace. I knew the rhythms of my land. A block party was not one of them. "We are expanding the venue this year," she announced, as if it were a great honor bestowed upon me. "The community center lawn is being resodded. Your road is the perfect, centrally located alternative. Now unlock the gate." I looked down at the heavy chain and the formidable padlock, its brass body gleaming in the sun. It was a symbol, a line drawn. I had retired a colonel, and in my 30 years of service I had learned that lines, once drawn, must be held. To yield even an inch was to invite a mile of encroachment. This was not a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. "No," I said. Her face, already flushed from the heat, deepened to a shade of crimson that clashed violently with her polo shirt. "I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I am telling you to open this gate. If you refuse to cooperate, I will have no choice but to issue a citation and a fine for obstructing a community event." I almost smiled. It was a fascinating threat, akin to a squirrel threatening an eagle with a nut embargo. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was almost impressive. She was standing on my land, threatening to fine me using the authority of an organization to which I did not belong for failing to facilitate her trespass. "You have no authority here," I said, the words clear and precise. "This is not part of your association. This is the last time I will tell you. Get your people and your equipment off my property. Now." She sputtered, a torrent of bureaucratic jargon and veiled threats pouring from her lips. She mentioned covenants, bylaws, community standards, and the general welfare. It was a smokescreen of official-sounding nonsense meant to intimidate and overwhelm. The men with the bounce house had stopped working, sensing the escalation. They looked like captured soldiers, unsure of their commander's orders in the face of unexpected resistance. I let her run out of ammunition. When she finally paused to take a heaving breath, I simply turned my back on her, walked the 20 feet to my truck, and retrieved my phone. I dialed the county sheriff's non-emergency line. I kept my voice level as I reported a group of trespassers who were refusing to leave my property. I gave my name and address, and the dispatcher informed me a deputy would be out as soon as one was available. Karen watched the entire exchange, her mouth agape. The call had been a strategic counter-salvo, one she hadn't anticipated. Her power was derived from her own little rulebook, her own insular kingdom of beige houses. Out here in the real world, county laws and property rights were the governing texts. She was an invading general who had just discovered her supply lines were cut. "You're calling the police?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "On your neighbors? For a block party? Unbelievable." I ignored her, returning to my position at the gate. The deputy arrived 20 minutes later, a young man with a calm demeanor who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He listened to her tirade first, nodding patiently as she waved a piece of paper she claimed was a permit. Then he walked over to me. "This your property, sir?" he asked. "It is," I replied. "Deeded and platted. The property line is the edge of the county highway. This entire road is mine." He took the permit from Karen and examined it. It was a reservation form for the Whispering Pines Community Center lawn, which she had simply crossed out and scribbled Community Access Road on. It was a child's forgery. The deputy sighed, the weary exhalation of a man who dealt with this brand of suburban madness far too often. He handed the paper back to her. "Ma'am, this isn't a permit for this location. This is private property. You and your party need to vacate." The defeat was absolute, and the humiliation was public. Her sycophantic followers watched as she was dressed down by a uniformed officer. She glared at me, a look of pure, undiluted venom. It was the look of a petty tyrant whose authority had been successfully challenged for the first time, perhaps ever. "This isn't over," she hissed, a low promise of future conflict. "You have just made a very powerful enemy." I simply watched as her defeated army packed up their bounce house and their folding tables, retreating back to the beige sea from whence they came. The war had begun, but the first battle was a decisive victory. I knew, however, that this was merely the opening skirmish. The paper assault would be next. I went inside, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and prepared to fortify my position. 3 days later, the first salvo of that paper assault arrived. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind of paper designed to convey an unearned sense of importance. The return address simply stated, "Whispering Pines, HOA, Office of the President." In the top left corner, the logo from Karen's polo shirt was embossed in a gaudy gold foil. I slit the envelope open with a letter opener that had been my father's, its handle carved from the antler of a deer he'd taken on this very land. The notice inside was printed on the same heavy bond paper. The language was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalese, clearly drafted by an amateur who had watched too many courtroom dramas. It was a formal notice of violation and intent to fine. It listed 3 infractions. First, obstruction of a sanctioned community event, with a fine of $200. Second, failure to maintain landscape to community standards, a vague accusation that I could only assume referred to the natural state of my woods bordering their subdivision, carrying a fine of $100 per day until rectified. And third, the catch-all charge of unneighborly conduct, a $500 penalty for the sheer audacity of calling the sheriff to report her trespass. A total of $800, with the landscaping fine set to accrue daily. I read the document twice, not out of disbelief, but to fully appreciate its strategic implications. This was not a rational bill for services rendered. This was a punitive strike, designed to punish dissent and establish a precedent of authority. Karen was attempting to annex my property into her little empire through sheer bureaucratic aggression. She was leveraging the fear that most people have of official-looking documents and the threat of escalating fines. Most people would likely just pay it to make the problem go away. I was not most people. A feeling settled over me then, a feeling I had not truly experienced since my retirement. It was not the hot, blinding rage of a personal insult. It was something colder, purer. It was a slow, dangerous calm. The calm of a sapper looking at a complex problem that needed to be dismantled, piece by piece with precision and care. This woman had declared war on my peace, on my home. She would find me a far more disciplined and methodical adversary than she could possibly imagine. My grandfather had been in the Signal Corps in the Second World War. My father was a logistics officer in Vietnam. I had spent 30 years with the Corps of Engineers, building things, and when necessary, planning their deconstruction. We were a family of planners, of strategists. We understood that passion was a poor substitute for a well-executed plan. I went down to the basement, to the cool, dry air that smelled of earth and old cedar. In the back corner, under a canvas tarp, sat my old footlockers from my last duty station. I opened one. The scent of starched uniforms and polished leather filled the air. I bypassed the memories and found what I was looking for. A heavy-duty, 3-inch D-ring binder. I also took out a set of tabbed dividers, a label maker, and a 3-hole punch. Back in my study, with the violation notice lying on my antique oak desk, I began the assembly. I typed a label and affixed it to the spine of the binder. It read, Operation Liberty Gate. This was no longer a spat with a neighbor. It was a campaign. I punched 3 neat holes in Karen's violation notice. I placed it behind the first tab, which I labeled Hostile Communications. The document, meant to be a weapon against me, was now the first piece of evidence in my arsenal. It was no longer a threat. It was Exhibit A. My opposition research had officially begun. The binder felt heavy and solid in my hands, a field manual for the war to come. A grim sense of satisfaction settled over me. The enemy had made her move. Now it was time for reconnaissance. The first phase of any campaign is intelligence gathering. You do not engage the enemy until you know their strength, their disposition, and most importantly, the terrain upon which you will fight. In this case, the terrain was not soil and rock, but paper and law. My first stop was the Whispering Pines HOA website. It was a poorly designed affair, full of pictures of smiling, homogeneous families and announcements about potlucks. Buried under a tab labeled Governance, I found my objective. The covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, or CC&Rs, and the association's bylaws. I downloaded every single PDF and printed them out. It was nearly 200 pages of dense, often contradictory, legalese. I spent the next 2 days in my study with a pot of coffee, a highlighter, and a stack of legal pads. I read every word. I cross-referenced the bylaws with the CC&Rs. I was not a lawyer, but I was an engineer. I knew how to read blueprints and technical manuals. This was no different. It was the blueprint for Karen's power, and I intended to find every load-bearing wall and every structural weakness, and the weaknesses were plentiful. I found procedural requirements for levying fines that she had clearly ignored. A written warning was required before any fine could be issued. I found rules about the jurisdiction of the association, which was explicitly and repeatedly defined as the lots and common areas depicted on the official plat map for the Whispering Pines subdivision, recorded in Book 1138, page 42 of the county records. This was a critical piece of intelligence. She had given me the coordinates to her own map. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse, a stately old building that smelled of floor wax and decaying paper. In the records office, a clerk who looked as old as the building itself helped me pull the plat map for Whispering Pines. And there it was, in crisp black and white, a cartographer's rendering of her entire kingdom. And clear as day, my property was outlined adjacent to it, labeled with my family's name and a completely different plat number, a number that dated back to 1908. My long gravel road was clearly depicted, entirely within the boundaries of my own parcel. I had her. This single piece of paper invalidated her entire claim. It was the legal equivalent of a royal flush. I paid the $10 for 3 certified copies of the map. One for the binder, one for my lawyer, and one for a purpose yet to be determined. This was the discovery of the higher authority. Her rulebook was subordinate to the county's, and the county's records were irrefutable. To solidify my position, I made one more stop. I went to the county code enforcement office. The official behind the counter listened with an air of profound boredom as I began my story. But as I laid out the details, the trespass, the fraudulent fine, the claim of jurisdiction over a separately deeded property, his posture changed. He sat up straighter. The boredom was replaced by a sharp, professional focus. This was no longer a petty neighborhood squabble. This was a quasi-governmental body acting far outside its legal authority. "She's trying to fine you for violations on property that isn't part of the HOA?" he asked, a note of incredulity in his voice. "That is correct," I said, sliding one of the certified plat maps across the counter. "Here's their plat, and here is mine." He studied the map for a long moment. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. He turned to his computer and began typing. "I'm opening a case file on this. An HOA attempting to enforce covenants on non-member property is a serious overreach. We'll be sending them a formal inquiry." He handed me a slip of paper with a case number on it. "That's your reference. Keep it." I walked out of the courthouse feeling 10 feet tall. I now possessed 2 critical pieces of leverage: irrefutable proof from the county records and an active case file with code enforcement. Operation Liberty Gate had moved from reconnaissance to strategic positioning. The next phase was to build a local insurgency. I knew from my study of the covenants that Karen's power relied on the passive consent of the governed. She ruled through fear and intimidation, a fine for a misplaced garbage can, a warning for holiday decorations left up a day too long. These were not major infractions, but 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed the residents of their will to resist. To defeat her, I needed to show them they were not alone. I needed to build a resistance. That afternoon, I took a walk. Not on my own land, but through the winding, identical streets of Whispering Pines. I was no longer just a neighbor. I was a field agent gathering intelligence on the occupied territory. The signs of the regime were everywhere. Every lawn was the same height. Every mailbox was the same model. There was a profound and unsettling lack of individuality. I saw an elderly woman tending her rose bushes. She had a small ceramic bird bath tucked away near her porch, almost hidden from view. As I approached, she looked up, and a flicker of anxiety crossed her face. "Good afternoon," I said warmly. "Those are beautiful roses." She relaxed slightly. "Oh, thank you," she said. "They were my husband's favorite." We chatted for a few minutes about gardening. Her name was Mildred Gable. Finally, I motioned toward the birdbath. "I hope you don't get in trouble for that," I said, my tone light. Her face fell. "Oh, I know. It's not on the approved list of yard decor. I got a warning letter last month. I'm supposed to have it removed, but the birds do so love it." Her voice was soft, resigned. She was a citizen living under occupation. "My name is Michael," I said, extending a hand. "I live on the old farmstead just through the woods." "I know who you are," she said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "You're the one who stood up to Karen about the block party. It's all anyone on the neighborhood email chain is talking about." So, the story of my small victory had spread. Good. That was the seed I needed to cultivate. "Mrs. Gable," I said, lowering my voice slightly, "I believe Mrs. Peterson's authority may not be as absolute as she presents it. I'm looking into the matter. Would you be willing to speak with me again at a later date?" A spark of something I hadn't seen before, hope, lit up her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "Yes, I would." I had my first recruit. I continued my walk and soon came across a young family, the Martinezes. The father was washing his car while two small children drew on the driveway with sidewalk chalk. They were creating a vibrant, sprawling mural of a castle and a dragon. It was a masterpiece of childhood joy. "That's quite the work of art," I commented to the father. He smiled, a tired but proud expression on his face. "Yeah, they love it. We'll have to hose it down before dark, though. We got a $25 fine last time for temporary graffiti." I shook my head in disbelief. "For sidewalk chalk?" "You must be new to the neighborhood," he said with a wry laugh. "Welcome to Whispering Pines. I'm David Martinez." We shook hands. I introduced myself and explained the situation with my property. "The block party lady," he said, his eyes widening in recognition. Man, I wish I could have seen that. She sent out a blistering email afterward about uncooperative bordering landowners and threats to community cohesion. "She also sent me a fine for $800, I said calmly. David stopped polishing his car. He looked at me, then at his children, then back at me. "You're not going to pay that, are you?" "Not a chance," I replied. "In fact, I'm planning to dismantle her entire platform, but I need to show a pattern of abuse. Fining children for chalk art seems like a good example." A slow, determined grin spread across David's face. He looked like a man who had been pushed one time too many. "You tell me what you need," he said. "We're in." By the time I returned home, the Allies and Grievances section of my binder was no longer empty. I had documented Mildred Gable's bird bath and David Martinez's chalk art fine. These were the stories, the human cost of Karen's petty tyranny. They were the seeds of a rebellion, and I would water them well. The insurgency was taking shape. Despite the strength of my position, I knew that a civilian campaign required professional support. An engineer can build a fortress, but you need an infantryman to take the hill. In this legal war, I needed a lawyer, a specialist. I didn't consult the yellow pages. In my world, you relied on your network, on people whose competence had been tested under pressure. I called a man I'd served with, a general now working at the Pentagon. I explained the situation briefly. He listened, chuckled, and said, "I know just the guy, a real bulldog, retired from JAG, ate people like your HOA president for breakfast. His name is Ben Carter." I got the number and made the call. Carter's voice was gravelly, no nonsense. I explained my situation, mentioning the key phrases HOA overreach, non-member property, trespass, and fraudulent fines. "I've handled a few of these," he grunted. "Most people just roll over. What makes you different?" "I have a binder," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A binder?" "Operation Liberty Gate," I clarified. "It contains hostile communications, certified county plat maps, a case number from code enforcement, and a growing list of grievances from other residents. It's organized and tabbed." The silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a professional recognizing a kindred spirit. "Colonel," he said, the gruffness in his voice replaced by a tone of respect, "I think we should meet. Bring your binder." His office was in a modest brick building downtown. No marble floors or mahogany desks, just functional furniture and walls lined with law books and a few framed commendations. Ben Carter was a man who looked like he'd been chiseled from granite. He was about my age, with a military haircut that had never grown out and eyes that missed nothing. He shook my hand with a grip of iron and pointed to a chair. "Let's see the opposition research," he said. I placed Operation Liberty Gate on his desk. It landed with a satisfying thud. He opened it and began to read. He didn't skim. He read every word, his eyes moving methodically from my notes to the official documents. He examined the certified plat map, holding it up to the light as if checking for watermarks. He tapped the code enforcement case number with his finger. He spent a long time in the Allies and Grievances section. After a full 20 minutes of silent review, he closed the binder, leaned back in his chair, and steepled his fingers. He looked at me and, for the first time, smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile. "Colonel," he said, "this is not a binder. This is a kill box. You've done 90% of my work for me. This woman has not only walked into the kill box, she's locked the door behind her." The feeling was electric. It was the profound satisfaction of having your meticulous preparation validated by a fellow expert. I felt 10 feet tall all over again. "Her mistake," Carter continued, "was treating you like every other resident she's bullied. She assumed you were a soft target. Instead, she picked a fight with a man who knows how to build a case as meticulously as he'd plan a bridge demolition." "So, what's our counter-salvo?" I asked. "We send a letter," he said, his smile widening. "But not just any letter. We're going to send her a precision-guided missile of a letter. It will be polite, professional, and utterly terrifying. It will cite the county codes she's violating. It will reference the plat maps by book and page number. It will mention the active code enforcement investigation. And it will inform her and every member of her board that by acting ultra vires, beyond their legal authority, they are no longer protected by the corporate shield of the HOA. They are personally, individually liable for harassment and for any legal fees I will bill you, which they will be court-ordered to reimburse. He paused to let the strategic implications sink in. We are not asking her to retreat. We are informing her of the facts on the ground and letting her walk deeper into the trap. We want her to escalate. Her ego won't be able to resist it. And when she does, she'll hang herself. He was right. It was a perfect strategy. It weaponized Karen's own arrogance against her. The legal counter-salvo was about to be launched, and it was aimed not just at the organization, but at the tyrant herself. The letter Ben Carter drafted was a work of art. It was printed on his firm's heaviest letterhead, and its 3 pages were a dense but clear recitation of facts, statutes, and consequences. It was mailed via certified post, requiring a signature to Karen's home address, with copies sent to every other listed board member. The delivery was a tactical strike, ensuring no one could claim they hadn't been warned. Then, we waited. For 10 days, there was silence. It was the eerie quiet before a storm. I used the time to continue my work. I had coffee with Mildred Gable and documented her story in a formal, witnessed statement. I attended a barbecue at the Martinez house, where David introduced me to 2 other families who had been fined for equally absurd violations. One for having a non-conforming garden hose reel, the other for their son's pickup truck being parked on the street for 2 hours while he visited. The insurgency was growing. Each new story added another page to the binder, another nail for Karen's coffin. The antagonist's blunder, when it came, was even more arrogant than we had predicted. She didn't call a disciplinary hearing. She didn't send another fine. She decided to directly defy the cease and desist letter in the most public and provocative way possible. The Whispering Pines monthly newsletter arrived in my mailbox, a courtesy, I suppose, for bordering landowners. On the front page, under a picture of Karen smiling her smug, self-satisfied smile, was the lead announcement. Annual block party rescheduled. Join us for fun, food, and community spirit on the Whispering Pines Community Access Road. We will not let unneighborly behavior stop our traditions. She had explicitly named my road. She had thrown down the gauntlet. She had read Ben Carter's meticulously crafted legal warning, with its threats of personal liability and its citation of state law, and her response was to double down. It was a breathtaking act of hubris. I immediately scanned the newsletter and emailed it to Ben. His reply was succinct. The fish has taken the bait and is now trying to drag the boat under. Let her. Document everything. The day of the rescheduled party arrived. I was prepared. I had 2 new high-resolution security cameras installed, covering the entire entrance to my road. I had a digital voice recorder in my pocket. I had my certified plat map and a copy of Ben's letter in a waterproof folder. I sat on my porch, a mile away, and watched the camera feed on my tablet. Right on schedule, they arrived. Not just a few tables this time, but a full-scale invasion. A catering truck, a DJ with a van full of speakers, and at least 30 residents, led by Karen herself, marching toward my gate like a conquering army. I drove my truck down the road and met them there, just as before. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. It was charged, confrontational. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate challenge to my ownership. "This is your final warning, Peterson," I said, my voice steady. I had decided to use her last name. It was a small thing, a denial of the false familiarity of a first name. "You are leading these people into a criminal trespass. Turn around now." "We have a right to be here," she bellowed, playing to her audience. "This is our community. You cannot intimidate us." "I have a letter here from my attorney," I said, holding up the folder. It was sent to you via certified mail. It explains in detail the legal reality of the situation. Every person you have brought here is currently trespassing. The moment any of you attempt to bypass this gate, you will have moved from civil trespass to criminal trespass. I am recording this entire interaction. The sheriff is on speed dial. A few of the residents in the back began to look nervous. They had come for hot dogs and bouncy castles, not a legal standoff, but Karen was resolute. "He's bluffing," she shouted. "He can't stop all of us. Let's set up." And then it happened. The final, critical mistake. A man I recognized as Karen's husband produced a massive pair of bolt cutters and approached the gate. He was going to destroy my property. This was the escalation Ben had predicted. This was the moment she crossed the line from bureaucratic harassment to an actual crime. I held up my phone, its screen clearly showing the live 911 call in progress. "Sheriff's Department, I am at my property at 1140 Old Mill Road. I am reporting an active attempt to commit criminal mischief and mass trespass. The leader of the group, Karen Peterson, has instructed her husband to destroy my gate with bolt cutters. Yes, I am recording the event. I will press charges." The effect was instantaneous. The man froze, bolt cutters halfway to the chain. The crowd murmured, the festive atmosphere completely evaporated. They were no longer partygoers. They were witnesses to a crime in progress. The word "charges" hung in the air like poison gas. Karen's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. She had lost control. Her bluff had been called, and her hand was empty. The sound of a distant siren began to grow closer. That was the final straw. Her army routed. People grabbed their kids, their coolers, and practically ran back toward the safety of the subdivision. Within 2 minutes, only Karen and her husband remained, standing amidst their abandoned party equipment, the bolt cutters lying on the ground between them like a fallen sword. The deputy who arrived was the same one as before. This time, he was not sighing. He was grim. He took my statement, reviewed my video, and then had a long, quiet talk with the Petersons. I did not press charges for the attempted damage, a strategic decision Ben and I had discussed. The goal was not a petty conviction. It was to secure the ultimate evidence of her recklessness. We had it. The video of her ordering her husband to destroy my property after receiving a legal cease and desist was the kill shot. The fallout from the failed invasion was swift. The story ripped through the neighborhood. Karen was no longer seen as a strong leader, but as a reckless zealot who had nearly gotten her neighbors arrested. Her power was fractured, and it was in that moment of weakness that the final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. 2 nights later, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a USB flash drive and a single typed note. "I am the HOA treasurer. I cannot be part of this anymore. She is going to ruin us all. Look in the contingency fund folder. I resign tomorrow." It was the inside source. The defector. A man named Arthur, whom I'd seen at meetings. A meek accountant who always seemed terrified of Karen. The lawyer's letter, with its mention of personal liability, had clearly broken him. I plugged the drive into my laptop. It was a complete copy of the HOA's financial records for the past 3 years. And there it was. The contingency fund. It was a slush fund. Payments for thousands of dollars to a landscaping company, Peterson Lawn Care, owned by Karen's brother-in-law, for no-bid contracts at grossly inflated prices. Payments to a law firm for general counsel, which were clearly her personal legal fees for her vendetta against me. And the most damning of all, a $10,000 expenditure from the Community Beautification Fund to a patio and deck company, dated 1 week after a brand new, elaborate patio had been completed at Karen's own house. She was not just a tyrant. She was a thief. This was the smoking gun. Operation Liberty Gate was now fully armed and operational. All that remained was to choose the final battleground. The annual HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. It would be a public execution. The battleground was the clubhouse of the Whispering Pines Community Center, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and desperation. The annual meeting was usually a sparsely attended affair, a rubber stamp for the existing board. Tonight, it was standing room only. Word had spread. My insurgency had done its work. David Martinez and Mildred Gable had gone door to door, not with anger, but with quiet conversations and copies of the chalk art fines and the birdbath warnings. They had awakened the silent, oppressed majority. The room was packed with residents, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and hope. Karen and her 2 remaining board cronies sat at a folding table at the front, looking out at the unusually large crowd with visible nervousness. She opened the meeting with her usual blend of condescending cheerfulness and bureaucratic process, reading through the minutes of the last meeting as if this were just another Tuesday. When the time came for new business, I stood up. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which I had spent the last week memorizing, any member, or in my case, an invited and aggrieved party, could request to be added to the agenda. "Madam President," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily through the silent room, "I would like to address the board and the members of this association regarding a series of unsanctioned and illegal actions taken by you and this board against a non-member." Karen's face tightened. "This is not the proper forum for personal grievances." "I believe it is," I countered, "as my grievance involves the gross misuse of this association's funds and authority. I move to be given 10 minutes to present my case." David Martinez immediately stood up. "I second the motion." A chorus of "I" erupted from the crowd. Karen was cornered. To deny the vote would be a transparently dictatorial move. She had no choice. "Fine," she snapped. 10 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, where David had already set up a projector and a laptop. The first image I put on the screen was the county plat map, my property, and the subdivisions clearly delineated. "This is the legal map of this community," I began. "As you can see, the authority of the HOA ends here." I used a laser pointer to trace the boundary line. My property is, and always has been, legally separate. Yet, for the past month, President Peterson has engaged in a campaign of harassment, levying fraudulent fines against me and attempting to seize my private road for HOA functions. I clicked to the next slide. A high-resolution photo of her husband with the bolt cutters, poised to cut my chain. A collective gasp went through the room after receiving a formal cease and desist letter from my attorney. This was President Peterson's response: to direct her husband to destroy my private property. This action, which I have on video, exposed not only herself, but this entire community to massive legal liability. I paused to let that sink in. Then I turned the floor over to my allies. But my case is not unique. It is merely the most extreme example of a pattern of abuse. Mildred Gable stood, her voice trembling but clear. She fined me $200 because my bird bath, a gift from my late husband, was not on the approved decor list. David Martinez stood next. My family was fined $25 because my children drew a picture of a dragon with sidewalk chalk on our own driveway. The dam broke. One by one, residents stood and voiced their own stories. A fine for a basketball hoop, a fine for a discolored shingle, a fine for an oil stain on a garage floor. It was a flood of petty, vindictive tyrannies, and with each story, Karen seemed to shrink in her chair. For the final act, I brought out the financial evidence. This behavior would be bad enough if it were merely an abuse of power, I said, my voice dropping to a serious, deliberate tone. But it is not. It is also a cover for blatant financial corruption. On the screen, I displayed the bank statement from the Community Beautification Fund, showing the $10,000 payment. Next to it, I displayed a public photo from Karen's social media page, posted just a week later, showing her and her husband beaming on their brand new $10,000 patio. "Cheers to our new backyard oasis," the caption read. The room erupted. The noise was a roar of betrayal and fury. This was the moment to spring the trap. Ben Carter, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. He was not introduced as my lawyer, but as a concerned homeowner from a neighboring community and an expert in HOA law. His presence commanded immediate attention. "Under state law," Ben began, his voice the very definition of authority, "when board members act with gross negligence or engage in self-dealing, they can be held personally liable for the financial damages. Every dollar President Peterson spent on her personal vendetta against Colonel Miller, every dollar she misappropriated for her own benefit, may have to be paid back not from the HOA's funds, but from her own pocket." Panic was now clearly visible on the faces of the other two board members. They were collateral damage in Karen's war, and they knew it. The coup de grace came from an unexpected quarter. Arthur, the former treasurer, who I did not know would be here, stood up from the middle of the crowd. His voice was no longer meek. It was filled with the righteous indignation of a man unburdened of a terrible secret. "I was the treasurer," he announced. "I resigned because I could no longer be complicit in this. The documents are real. I have the originals. I move for a vote of no confidence in the entire board and for their immediate removal from office, effective now." "Seconded!" shouted a dozen voices at once. Karen tried to shout over the noise, banging a tiny gavel on the table, but it was useless. She had lost the room. She had lost her empire. The motion was called to a vote. "All in favor of removing the board, say aye." The resulting sound was not a vote. It was a catharsis, a deafening, unanimous roar of "aye" that shook the cheap acoustic tiles in the ceiling. All opposed? Silence. Utter, complete, and devastating silence. It was over. Karen stared out at the sea of angry faces, her own face pale and slack with shock. Her reign had ended not with a bang, but with a unanimous public shaming. She gathered her purse, and without another word, she fled the room, her cronies scurrying after her. The petty tyrant had been deposed. In the immediate aftermath, the community seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for years. A new interim board was elected on the spot, with David Martinez as president and Arthur, to his surprise and reluctance, re-elected as treasurer. Their first official act was a unanimous vote to void every fine levied by Karen over the past year. Their second was to issue a formal, written apology to me and to every other resident who had been targeted. Their third was to hire a forensic accountant and turn over all findings to the district attorney's office. The healing began almost immediately. The next day, I saw children's chalk drawings on half a dozen driveways. Mildred Gable's bird bath was moved to the center of her lawn, a proud monument to her quiet defiance. The oppressive atmosphere of fear was replaced by a palpable sense of relief and unity. A week later, I received a visit from David Martinez. He formally invited me to a neighborhood barbecue, a real one this time, to celebrate their Independence Day. I accepted. That Saturday, for the first time, I left my gate wide open. I walked down my long road and into the heart of Whispering Pines, not as an outsider or an adversary, but as a respected neighbor. I was greeted not just with gratitude, but with genuine warmth. They saw me not as the man who had started a war, but as the man who had ended one. We learned later that the forensic audit had uncovered over $50,000 in misappropriated funds. Faced with criminal charges and a civil suit from the HOA to recoup the money, Karen and her husband were forced to sell their house to cover the legal fees and restitution. Their beige castle, built on a foundation of petty tyranny and embezzlement, was sold to a young family who immediately installed a basketball hoop. Months have passed since that night in the community center. The peace I retired to seek has returned, but it is a different kind of peace now. It is not the peace of isolation, but the profound, hard-won peace that comes from restoring order and justice. It is a peace I share with the community that I was reluctantly forced to liberate. This evening, as the sun sets over my land, I sit on my front porch. The binder, Operation Liberty Gate, rests on the small table beside me. Its mission is complete. I pick it up, walk over to the stone fire pit my grandfather built, and remove the pages one by one. The violation notices, the plat maps, the financial records, the witness statements. I drop them into the pit. I strike a match and watch as the paper evidence of a small, necessary war curls into ash and rises with the smoke, disappearing into the twilight sky. The gate to my road remains unlocked. My farm is quiet. Cincinnatus has returned to his plow.